Every century in our village, a woman who looks exactly the same would appear. She would pass away peacefully on her 100th birthday. The villagers called her the Ancestor. The Ancestor held a unique position in our village. In the grand ancestral hall, there were portraits of them, all 5 dressed in the clothing of their eras, each adorned differently. The most recent portrait was a black and white photo of about 17 inches, taken in 1921. The girl in the picture was young and beautiful, with the typical bangs worn by girls of that time, and her thickly braided hair, bushy eyebrows, and clear eyes captivated anyone who saw it. This old forebear passed away in 2001, and on that very day, a baby girl born in the village was named Natalie Morgan. Natalie became our new ancestor. I was 1 year younger than Natalie, and I grew up listening to stories of the ancestor, which instilled in me a natural reverence for her. Natalie was different from the other children. She was solitary, always wandering alone, fond of sitting atop the tall mountain peak at the edge of the village, lost in thought. The other village kids were somewhat afraid of her, but not me. Fearless as I would follow her around, calling out "Sister," whether she paid me any attention or not. I was charming, sweet-talking, and clingy, and over time, I grew closer to Natalie. I found that despite her aloof exterior, she was actually a tender person. She cared for the creatures and plants in the mountain forest and was kind to me, often chasing away insects and picking fruits I couldn't reach while I slept. I saw Natalie as an older sister, never giving much thought to her status as the ancestor, nor keeping my distance as others did. Our village was poor with only one primary school. Middle school was several kilometers away in the town, so village children had to board there. Natalie was gentle, beautiful, and smart. I naturally assumed she would continue with education, as we all did, from primary to middle school and beyond. However, after primary school, Natalie dropped out. I couldn't believe it when I heard the news and naively confronted her. "Natalie, why did you stop going to school?" She was sitting under the big date tree at the entrance of the village, her head bowed, a strand of hair partially obscuring her face. Hidden in the shade of the tree, she appeared somewhat gloomy as she coldly replied, "The town is too far. I can't go." "What do you mean too far? It's just over 2 hills." I protested loudly, unhappy with her answer. Suddenly, Natalie looked up, her pitch-black eyes fixating on me with a depth like an unfathomable lake, instilling an unknown fear. A shiver ran down my spine, and I found myself unable to speak, struck by her gaze. For the first time, I found Natalie frightening. It led to an extended period of nightmares where ghouls taking on Natalie's appearance would come after me. Each time a nightmare woke me, the memory of her gaze from that day would cause me to tremble beneath my covers. From then on, I, like others in the village, kept my distance from Natalie, treating her with a respectful wariness. Natalie seemed indifferent to the change, going about her life, seemingly unconcerned with the comings and goings of others. My father was the most successful man in the village. He made a fortune selling fruit in the city. Thanks to my father's success, I became the only person from our village who could leave for the big city to attend high school. My father, proud as anything, threw a huge banquet to celebrate, and Natalie actually showed up, which was out of character for her. She never joined such gatherings, her absence always noted. My father felt honored and insisted I entertain her warmly. It had been some time since Natalie and I had last met, and she was growing to resemble those portraits in the ancestral hall. The sudden sight of her was startling. Our relationship had become distant. I reluctantly invited her to sit, and she complied. Perhaps it was because we were a few years older, but I noticed her manners were refined. There was none of the rustic air one would expect. Instead, she exuded a different kind of grace, poised like a lady of ancient times. The thought made me break out into a cold sweat. I sat beside Natalie rigidly, wishing my father would come and take my place. But that day was awkward. My father was overwhelmed with the other villagers' demands to drink with them. He never made it past 2 tables before he was out for the count. Left without rescue, I sat with Natalie in silence until, fortunately, she said she had to leave. Feeling relieved, I was about to get up to see her off when she suddenly bent forward, her long hair cascading down. It felt like a thick curtain was enveloping me, and all I could see was Natalie's face drawing close. Her complexion was pale, her eyes as dark and unfathomable as an ancient well, which frightened me. I nearly jumped out of my chair. She kept one hand on my shoulder, pinning me down, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Wendy, remember to come back, okay?" she whispered. I was so stiff with fear I didn't move for a good while. That night I had a sleepwalking episode. Terrified, I ran desperately. When reality blended with my dream, my father said that while everyone was sound asleep, I had burst out of the door and sprinted out. He thought we had burglars and only caught a glimpse of my fleeing shadow. Woken from his sleep, he knew something was off with me and chased after me. It was pitch dark in the village, and I was running faster than a rabbit. My dad shouted for me from behind, but I didn't hear. He followed me all the way to the mountaintop, only to watch me jump off. My father said he felt his legs give out, kneeling on the ground, his world collapsing as he saw me leap. I asked him, "Then what happened?" He wiped away tears. "You know how your dad climbed down the mountain, crying his eyes out? Thank goodness Aunt Chen had just cleared the underbrush and piled up some grass at the base of the cliff. Otherwise, I'd be collecting your lifeless body." I interrupted him, urgently asking, "Didn't you see anyone else on your way to find me?" "What person?" my father asked. "There was not a soul in sight. Where would anyone be?" But I clearly remembered seeing Natalie when I was barely hanging on to life, her feeding me something. A cold dread crept up from my bones. I couldn't be sure if I had truly seen her. After all, I was half in the realm of the dead at the time. My mind wasn't clear. Maybe it was all a dream, yet many things were puzzling. Why did I sleepwalk? It had never happened before. And why would I jump off a cliff? Throughout the incident, there was no evidence linking Natalie, yet her presence loomed everywhere. If it hadn't been for her, I wouldn't have had that frightful sleepwalking episode. The mountaintop I leapt from was her favorite place to sit and daydream. After my fall, Natalie, who shouldn't have been there, seemed to have been there. The more I thought about it, the more terrified I became, sweating profusely. I developed a deep unease about the village and Natalie, and after being discharged from the hospital, I didn't go anywhere else. I'd simply following my father back to the city. For 7 years, I never returned to the village. I completed high school in the city, went to university, and got a boyfriend. He was a bona fide city dweller who had never set foot in a village. While we were together, I would talk about my childhood, and without realizing it, I told him a lot about the village. The happiness of childhood is always unforgettable. Even if the departure was unpleasant, the memories that came flooding back years later were still those of joy. My boyfriend was fascinated by life in a mountain village, and I impulsively thought of taking him there during the summer break for him to experience authentic village life. I mentioned the idea to him, and he immediately agreed. After 7 years, I found myself on the path back to the village. My feelings shifted from initial excitement to a deep nervousness as we proceeded. Noticing my sudden mood change, my boyfriend asked, "What's wrong?" I thought about it and decided to give him a heads up. "Well, I haven't told you before, but there's something really strange about our village." His interest was piqued. "Go on, tell me." I briefly mentioned the ancestor, and he was quite intrigued, asking a lot of questions. I told him everything I knew. It was strange. Other little mountain villages had made progress over the years, if not becoming rich, at least opening up roads. But my hometown village seemed almost unchanged, as if forgotten by the soaring economic development. My dad drove us in his second-hand truck to the town. We parked at a friend's place. The three of us carried several bags over the hills for a few kilometers until we finally stepped onto the familiar muddy road. No matter how tense or uneasy I had been previously, walking on the familiar country path made me feel a long-missed joy, and my mood improved. My grandparents were waiting for us under the big date tree at the entrance to the village. Seeing their stooped figures with white hair stirred in me a rush of tears. It was rare for outsiders to visit the village. Soon, villagers gathered in 2s and 3s at my grandparents' house to see the novelty and my exotic-looking boyfriend. We were in charge of distributing the snacks and candies we'd brought to everyone. Many childhood friends were now running around in the dirt, and a string of little ones lined up calling me Auntie. I, who had always been called Sister, was suddenly filled with a sense of tender compassion. After entertaining the local folks, my boyfriend persuaded me to take him to see the legendary portraits of the ancestor in the ancestral hall. "You can't see them," I tried to dissuade him. "The hall is usually locked by the clan leader, our village chief, and is only opened during ceremonies." But he wasn't deterred. "We won't go in, just a look at the front gate." Now I understood where those fearless characters in horror movies came from. Art imitates life. On the way to the ancestral hall, we encountered Natalie. I had seen the portrait of the ancestor in the hall before and knew how beautiful she's supposed to be, but even so, I had underestimated her. After years apart, Natalie had fully grown into the image of the ancestor. Her raven black eyebrows and hair, almond-shaped eyes, and red lips. I had always considered myself not unattractive, but in comparison to her approaching presence, I felt nearly invisible. My boyfriend gaped at Natalie, unblinking. She wore that familiar faint smile that had haunted my childhood nightmares. Instinctively, I tried to hide behind my boyfriend, but catching a glimpse of his worthless expression, I suddenly wasn't afraid of anything anymore. "You're back." Natalie greeted me first. I responded with an awkward smile. Her gaze shifted to my boyfriend. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I felt like she lingered on him a bit too long. He greeted her back nonchalantly. I was very unhappy with my boyfriend's behavior. After Natalie walked away, he still turned to watch her. "She's the ancestor, right?" my boyfriend asked. "What's her name again?" "Natalie Morgan." "Nice name." When he finally managed to turn his head back to face me, he saw my arms akimbo and eyes blazing. He laughed, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. Let's go to the ancestral hall to see the portraits." "See what?" I gave him a kick. As I expected, my boyfriend, having no experience with village life, might struggle at first. But to my surprise, he adapted better than me, enjoying the food and sleep. It was the height of summer, and the plum trees were fruiting. I fitted him with a straw hat and planned to spend a day experiencing the life of a fruit farmer. Wild plum trees grew tall, and I was cheerfully using a fruit-catching pole when suddenly, among the rustling green leaves, a pale, bloodless face appeared. The shock nearly sent me tumbling from the tree. Natalie was standing there, her dark eyes void of warmth, quietly shifting her gaze from me to my boyfriend. "Do you want to go to the top of the mountain?" she bluntly asked my boyfriend. Wendy used to love playing with me up there. My boyfriend leaped down from the plum tree. "Sure," he agreed so quickly, without even asking me. Natalie Morgan led the way in front. My boyfriend followed behind her. I walked at the very back, huffing and puffing, kicking stones along the path. I remembered the first time I met my boyfriend. That day, wearing a new dress, I walked past him. He glanced up and his gaze stopped on me. How should I describe that look in his eyes? Before he saw me, all was calm, but the moment he saw me, ripples seemed to dance in his eyes. He fell in love with me at first sight. People say love at first sight isn't reliable. A man can fall for you at first sight, and he can do the same with someone else. And why couldn't that someone else be Natalie Morgan? Feeling sour inside, I listlessly followed them to the top of the mountain. In fact, the view from the mountaintop is uniquely beautiful. The spot where Natalie often sat offered a panoramic view of the entire village. At that moment, my boyfriend stood there. He stretched, gazed at the view, grinning from ear to ear. I kicked stones all the way up the mountain, then, in a huff, stomped them into the mud when suddenly my boyfriend said, "From this angle, the landscape below forms a jar." He mentioned it casually, but Natalie jerked her head up. I wasn't in the mood for what jar meant or not, but Natalie's strange reaction puzzled me. So I left the little stone and walked to the edge. Because of a shadowy fear from years ago, I didn't get too close, just looked out at the distance. Looking left and right, I couldn't make out a jar. I scoffed at my boyfriend. "Nonsense." He chuckled, picked up a twig, and drew on the ground. Not the English jar, but the Chinese jar. Following the character he drew, I looked again. And he was right. From above, our village really did resemble a Chinese jar. "You, an American, understand Chinese?" My boyfriend shamelessly replied, "Got to know a little bit of everything. You never know when it might come in handy, right?" That "right" wasn't directed at me, but at Natalie standing nearby. Natalie looked stunned, and she unconsciously nodded. My chest blazed with rage, an adulterous pair, flirting right in front of me. I had no idea how my boyfriend and Natalie had gotten together. Eventually, rumors spread throughout the village. Even my dad heard some of it. He waited for me at home with a cup of tea. I woke up from a nap and stepped out of my room. My dad asked me, with a face that was neither eyes nor nose, "Where's your boyfriend?" Sleepy and confused, I replied, "Huh." My dad gulped down his tea and scolded, "Sleeping, always sleeping. The man has run off with someone else, and you're still asleep." If my dad hadn't mentioned it, I wouldn't have known that every afternoon while I took a nap, my boyfriend was with Natalie, spotted many times by the villagers. They weren't discreet, sneaking around behind my back, but rather parading around as if wanting the whole village to know. My head was green with envy. Unable to stand me being treated like this, my dad wanted to confront my boyfriend. I stopped him. "Leave it. I'll handle my own boyfriend." My boyfriend hadn't returned from Natalie's place, so I started packing my bags. I didn't have much luggage, it was quickly packed, and that's when my boyfriend came back. I tossed the bags to him. "Let's go, back to the city today." Holding the luggage, he sat down on a stool and said to me, "I'm not leaving." I got irritated. "What do you mean? You've fallen for her?" My tall and leggy boyfriend sat on the stool, looking all relaxed and cheerful. Resting his elbow on his knee and his chin in his hand, he grinned at me. I got even angrier and pointed at his nose. "Clear your head. She's pretty, but you two aren't necessarily compatible." He nodded repeatedly. Right. "So what do you mean now?" I asked him. "You really want to stay here by yourself?" He put the luggage down, looked up seriously and said, "Yes." I found it incredulous and raised my voice. "Has she bewitched you?" He scratched his head. "No, you're overthinking it." I knew him well enough, though we hadn't been together long. He was a straight arrow, despite his casual demeanor, and he wouldn't do anything inappropriate. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I brought him to the village. I couldn't ignore the strangeness happening to him. I don't know where I found the courage, but I dared to seek out Natalie alone. First, I went to her house. Her mom said she had gone up the mountain. Huffing and puffing, I finally found Natalie on the mountain top. She was indeed sitting in her usual spot, admiring the landscape. I stopped 2 meters behind her. Realizing I was there, she turned and looked at me, her eyes calm like still water. I unconsciously felt nervous, leaning against a large rock behind me. I mustered the courage and stuttered at her. "You and my boyfriend. You too." Hearing me mention my boyfriend, her eyes visibly darkened, excited light seeming to flicker within their depths. I was almost certain she was plotting something with my boyfriend. The many questions stuck in my throat. Suddenly feeling weak, I almost begged her, "Natalie, let him go." Natalie tilted her head. She stood up from the ground with a strange smile and started walking towards me. "Do you remember what happened 7 years ago?" she asked as she walked. "That night you sleepwalked and jumped from here." Right then, her approach reminded me of the nightmares I had. Sweat the size of soybeans seeped out of my forehead, and instinctively I wanted to run, but the hot rock at my back made it hurt to move. My legs went weak, and I couldn't lift my feet. "Don't come any closer." I tried to stop her without really seeing. Natalie kept moving, calmly telling me step by step, "That incident was my doing. I made you sleepwalk and jump off the cliff." My heart raced in terror, thinking it was indeed her. Natalie stopped in front of me, staring down at me, her lips moving slowly. "I'm sorry." I was frozen in fear for a second. "Huh?" She continued in a detached tone. "I had to do it. I was stunned." "What do you mean?" Natalie didn't answer. She grabbed my hand and led me towards the edge of the mountain. Seeing her abnormal demeanor, I was terrified she would push me off. I struggled with all my might, screaming, "Let go of me!" Natalie made a shush gesture and said quietly, "Look." As if beguiled, I stopped. The mountain breeze blew, lifting a strand of her hair. Natalie let go of my hand and, like countless times before, gazed into the distance. Only then did I see the desolation in her eyes. "Do you see?" She pointed downward. "That's the jar." I was confused. Her familiar blank expression returned. Centuries ago, this was a general's land. The unique feng shui led him to construct a huge jar formation here, forcing people to move into this estate, becoming the first generation of villagers. "What is a jar formation?" I asked. Natalie's voice was cold. The jar formation is a geomancy matrix that steals luck. Everyone born here has their fortune drained, nourishing the formation's master and his descendants. It sounded like a fable to me. Unbelievable. Natalie continued, the villagers' fortune is drained, leaving them poor and destitute. Few can leave. Her eyes fixed on mine, as if imparting a secret. Even if you can leave, it doesn't mean you can escape because your roots are here. I felt my world shattering, staring at Natalie, unsure how to react. She lowered her gaze, asking softly, guess why every 100 years, someone who looks exactly the same is born? I shook my head in bewilderment. Natalie's mouth curved with bitterness. The so-called ancestor is actually the jar formation's focal point. It's been the same soul from the beginning, trapped here, unable to reincarnate or stray from the formation, not even reaching the next town. Then it dawned on me, horrified. That was why she dropped out of school. She had been trapped in the village for centuries. I was shocked and began to feel deep sympathy for Natalie. Her eyes were filled with melancholy, as if lamenting her fate. Speaking rarely with such gentleness, she said, you are exceptionally lucky. Even within this formation, you still had the chance to go to the city. You don't know how happy I was when I found out you could leave this place. Her eyes softened, and I remembered how, many years ago, when I was just a child clinging to her, she would look at me with that same gentleness. But after all that had happened, she became more and more terrifying in my eyes. I never saw that look on her face again until now. My eyes filled with tears, and I wanted to cry. It seemed Natalie, too, was reminiscing, her voice dropping. I planted a seed in you. Since ancient times, dark arts have been rejected from society. The jar formation has remained hidden here, undiscovered. I hoped the seed in you would send a message out, attracting someone who could help. But, limited by my ability, I could only plant the seed in someone near death. Out of desperation, I made you jump off the cliff, risking your life. Memories linked together in my mind, and the doubts that once clouded my thoughts suddenly became clear. Logically, I should hate her for harming me, but I couldn't bring myself to say the words of hate. Confused, I sat for a moment, then a thought struck me. I covered my mouth in shock. The person you mentioned, it couldn't be. My boyfriend? The world was so fantastical. I ran home to find my boyfriend. Laid back as ever, he was lounging on my grandfather's rocking chair, cooling off. Seeing me run back, drenched in sweat, he cheerfully asked, how did it go? Did you clear things up? Breathless, I asked him, is everything she said true? My boyfriend's eyes crinkled with a smile. Of course. I froze again, and then indignantly said, so the first time you saw me, it wasn't because you fell in love at first sight, but because you saw the seed in me? My boyfriend doubled over, laughing. Ha! You actually thought I fell in love with you at first sight. I was speechless, my fists pounding on him. He let me hit him a few times before he stopped laughing and said, don't be mad. The one you're meant to be with isn't me. Besides, think about it. Do we act like a couple? We're just friends. I thought about it carefully, and it was true. We've been together for a year, and we've never even held hands. But I was still mad he hid it from me, and I demanded, then who are you really? My boyfriend stood up from the rocking chair, his smile bright and earnest, and told me, just call me your boyfriend, that's enough. I scoffed, in your dreams. Natalie Morgan and Andrew Carter roamed the village daily, and occasionally I'd join them. The three of us, coexisting harmoniously, became a spectacle in our village. My dad now shakes his head at me, repeatedly asking if I should go back to the city. I poured all my heart into coping with the old man. Days passed, and then one afternoon, as I was about to take a nap, Andrew Carter and Natalie Morgan walked into my house, one after the other. A sudden thud in my chest gave me a vague understanding of what was happening. Natalie Morgan looked at me in silence, her lips blossoming into a serene smile. We've met and shared moments together. Won't you come to send me off? I fought back tears as I trudged up the mountain. The two ahead of me didn't care about my feelings and climbed swiftly. In less than 10 minutes, we reached the summit. Natalie stood at the edge, gazing at the scenery she knew by heart, her smile as warm as the spring breeze. My eyes were already red as a rabbit's. Natalie turned around, her gentle gaze resting on me. I couldn't hold back any longer and flung myself into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Ooh, Natalie, I forgive you. I'm not mad at you anymore. She gently stroked my head and whispered in my ear, "Thank you, Wendy." As tears overflowed, she wiped them away from me. "You should be happy for me. I've waited 500 long years for this day, and I'm finally about to be free. If there's another life," she said, "I hope we can meet again." I nodded tearfully. "We'll still be close sisters. I'll take you to eat delicious food, to travel to many, many places, never to the mountains again." Natalie's eyes filled with longing as she said, "Good." Then she offered a solemn bow to Andrew, a gesture of ancient times. "Master, I beg your assistance." Andrew nodded. Natalie smiled and spread her arms wide, like a bird ready to take flight. Andrew held me back behind him. When had he procured a piece of talisman paper in his hand? With a steady grip on the talisman, he chanted under his breath. A wind seemed to rise from within the woods, and Andrew's voice boomed like thunder. "Dismiss." The talisman paper streaked through the air like a sword, emitting a muffled rip sound. Bang! Something shattered? My mind buzzed as if electrified, and it felt as though something quietly and ceaselessly poured into my being. This sensation was mystical, perceived only for a brief moment. As I came to my senses, I saw Natalie's body gradually turn transparent, inch by inch vanishing before my eyes, her face wearing a peaceful smile of release. The focal point of the array was broken. The formation was destroyed. I spent days wandering the village with Andrew. He led me to smash huge rocks, dig into the mountain ridges, alter spring sources, and modify the feng shui. These were all things Natalie and he had unearthed bit by bit, intending from the start to completely destroy the formation and leave no chance for it to revive. On the first day, I mourned Natalie's departure. The next day, I felt deep sorrow for their well-intentioned efforts. On the third day, I diligently helped Andrew, hoping Natalie would find happiness in her next life. And then came the fourth, the fifth, the sixth day. I noticed that those who wondered where the ancestor had gone suddenly stopped asking. The portraits in the ancestral hall turned blurry and indistinct. I also realized that I could scarcely remember things associated with Natalie. I asked Andrew, "Will we all forget her?" "Forgetting is a good thing," Andrew replied. Anxious, I rushed back to my room and scrawled in my notebook, "Remember to take Natalie traveling, but not to the mountain villages." Back in the city from the village, my life became a whirlwind of busyness. My graduate school exam results came in, and I got into the school of my dreams. An art piece I had competed with won first prize, a TV station wanted to interview me, the school arranged for me to give a speech. That year, as the government fostered rural economic construction, they arranged for my dad to represent our village in talks with fruit wholesalers. My dad led the villagers to plant orchards. The once impoverished villagers jumped at the chance to become prosperous fruit farmers, with everyone's days looking up, each household filled with new hope. Andrew and I broke up, but we became good friends. Every time I saw him, I felt like I was forgetting something. Whenever I doubted, Andrew would reassure me with a grin. "Don't worry, if you forget, I'll remember to remind you." "All right," with his word, I stopped fretting. Andrew, despite his seemingly careless demeanor, was actually pretty reliable.